You're looking good, and it feels good to be with you today. Hello, I'm Kendall Bryan Hunter, author of this book, Consider My Servant Job. Get a head start on the Old Testament next year, and this is Come Follow Me, Get to the Point. Well, it's today. Today, we cover the word of wisdom. I've been hinting at it, I've been talking about it. Is it a commandment? Is it a revelation? Is it optional? Can you just do whatever you good and whatever you feel good about is the right thing? It's interesting in context. There's a sister who served a mission and apparently was born in the covenant and has since chosen to leave the church. Her name's Alyssa Grenfield. It's interesting. Her slogan is, "I gave up eternal life for coffee." Okay, that's funny. That's clever. It really gets to the point. But Alyssa bottoms up. And this is something else, as I think it was a couple of weeks ago, maybe about 3 weeks ago, Lindsey Sterling came out, and this is a bit shocking, since we all had good hopes for her. Lindsey Sterling came out saying that she was drinking coffee now. And this is an issue. I've noticed this with people who leave the church. They don't become bank robbers. There's a little problem with the lighting here. People, they just don't become bank robbers. They are still good people, good citizens, decent human beings. There we go. Yeah, I got the funny lighting issue. It's just bothering me getting the rings on my eyes. So let's try it this way. But good people, they aren't keeping their covenants. They're, I'll just forget this. I just don't like the lighting's just not good. So people who leave the church, they start drinking coffee and tea, don't wear the temple garment. They still are good people. They're good neighbors, good citizens, good human beings. But they are doing some things. And I always think about this. Out of all the things you want to criticize Joseph Smith for, word of wisdom, that's not it. It's too much hard scientific data backing that up. That it's funny that they go with this, and it's an appetite thing. It's a social thing. Another thing about the word of wisdom. So this is about word of wisdom, and we'll talk a little bit about caffeine later on, where that's part of it. But I work at a hospital. I was talking with one of the nurses there, and she mentioned this story. Is that sometimes in the what do you call it? Let me pause this for a second. There, I have better lighting. My face was looking a little bit funny, unrealistic. I was looking like a cartoon character. So remember, good lighting. This is visual. So I was telling you a story. I work at a hospital. I was talking with one of the nurses, and she said that in the intensive care unit, sometimes they'd get discharges, so it'd be staffed with a certain number of nurses. They'd discharge, and sometimes they'd have more nurses than was necessary for the patient count. So how they decided which nurse would go home is they took each other's blood pressure, and whoever had the highest blood pressure would be the one to go home. As just pointed out, it was really obvious to tell which people were drinking sports drinks and who wasn't. There's that gap in the blood pressure. Now think about having that, the drinks you're drinking, caffeinated, even if you feel comfortable about it. What all the caffeine does over time, over 5, 6, 8 decades of life. What's that do to your body? What does that do to the capillaries in your eyes with all that high blood pressure with the capillaries in your eyes when you drink that? So that's something to think about that. Now, having said this, I got this quote. This is from President Nelson. Now, he wrote this in his book, The Power Within Us. This is before his call to be a apostle and to be president of the church, and it has some of his earlier talks prior to be calling as a general authority in there. So The Power Within Us, page 53. And President Nelson, remember, he has a medical doctor. He's a double doctorate, MD, PhD. Yeah, so he's qualified, however you slice it. But he said this: in our efforts to proclaim the virtue of obedience, we might unwisely teach with inappropriate emphasis. We might teach with an appropriate emphasis. For example, many important facts and figures are sometimes cited to illustrate the great physical benefits that come from obedience to the word of wisdom, just like I did. We know that cigarette smoking is the single most important preventable cause of heart disease, cancer, artery disease, and lung disease. But do we obey the word of wisdom because medical science affirms the physical benefits that follow? To test this concept, what would be your response if, as a parent, you were told that your son should obedient to the word of wisdom, even if medical science had evidence, which it does not, to suggest that obedience would be harmful to your health? What would you do? Would you follow the counsel of medical science, or would you listen and follow the word of God? Now, let's think about that. And you're going to hear this sometime in General Conference, people citing medical statistics for backing up the word of wisdom. And so when people start having issues like Alyssa or Lindsey Sterling, give them the back of your mind. It's scientifically bad, but it's also theologically bad. And make sure we're building on the correct foundation, is what President Nelson is saying. To do this, for example, suppose the word of wisdom told us that we should eat a box of Twinkies every day. Now, it doesn't say that, but would you eat a box of Twinkies every day if the word of wisdom said that? What's your foundation? Do you have to filter it through science before you believe it? Do you have to have a footnote from B.H. Roberts, Bruce R. McConkie, or Hugh Nibley before you believe something? Before you do it? Do you look into peer pressure? Do you turn to your political party? So let's think about it. Let's dive into this. Now, I'm going to start with the other sections. This is get to the point. I'll save the best for last, but I'm going to take a thematic approach just because sometimes the Doctrine and Covenants does not lend itself to a steady theme. So point one is the church. It's the First Presidency in section 90. Now, you can read about that in the Joseph F. Smith Manual, chapter 25. It talks a lot about it. It tells you everything you need to know. Joseph Smith was given keys of the kingdom, and then Sidney Rigdon and Frederick G. Williams, his counselors, were told that he is equal with thee in holding. Now, how we do things now in the church, and sometimes I did things a little bit differently. You know, Joseph Smith had all these counselors, and David O. McKay had a lot of counselors. As a kid, Spencer W. Kimball had a quote-unquote third counselor, Gordon B. Hinckley. He wasn't called a third counselor, he was just called as a counselor. But you understand that the counselors of the First Presidency, if they're apostles, they've already been given keys of the kingdom, so they hold that when they're ordained to the apostleship. Sometimes, as the case with J. Reuben Clark and Charles Nibley, who were called just as high priests into the First Presidency, they weren't ordained apostles. I'm not sure how that works with that. Those are unusual circumstances. But when it says that the counselors hold equal with thee in holding the keys of the kingdom, my understanding is unless they're an apostle and given that, they can function under the direction of the keys. That's not what the verbiage says, but that's what my understanding is. So that, listen, I'm for example, the office I hold as a high priest. Let's say I get a call from President Nelson. He calls me into the First Presidency and decide not to ordain me an apostle. So I get set apart. Even though my ordained office is a high priest, if I'm told to do something, I'm acting under the direction of President Nelson's keys. I don't hold them, but I'm acting under the direction. That's what my understanding of this would be. Even though it sounds like that's what that's saying. Although they may have been ordained, it may not have been recorded, and we just, maybe, you understand the records are really good, but sometimes here and there's stuff that's a little bit confusing. In the Joseph F. Smith Manual, President Joseph F. Smith always said there were 3 presidents. 3 people who can exercise authority. Now, we've had this recently when I was a teenager, as Spencer W. Kimball got quite ill in the latter days of his life, and you had the rest of the First Presidency was ill, and Eldon Tanner and Marion G. Romney. And if you've read President Gordon B. Hinckley's life, he'd be the only member of the First Presidency, and he's de facto president of the church because he's the person in charge. He's a member of the First Presidency. You understand how it works. And the president, the counselors can sub in for the president. So there's certain things they can do, certain things they can't do. Then that happened later on with Ezra Taft Benson as he aged. So you kids nowadays, you get it kind of funny where you have a centenarian prophet. You know, President Nelson's going to be turning 101 shortly, and he's still alive and kicking. You know, his always talked about his eyes are aging, and he used a big teleprompter, but First of all, anyone who's 101 years old, that's just interesting in its own right. I mean, the Pope or a head rabbi or your imam from whoever, if they're 101, I think that'd be interesting. But that's what happens is the counselors can step in and take charge of stuff. President Hinckley addressed this, called The Church is on Course from the October 1992 conference. I remember I was taking Teachings of the Living Prophet with a Brentel top, and when I was taking it in the, I guess you call it the fall semester, when that gave that talk, he's publishing a book. He had to call up this book and say, "Okay, stop the presses. We need to include this talk in my book." And he was able to include it, where he explained the dynamics between when a president gets incapacitated. This just happens. The church keeps saying the same thing. It just doesn't register with people, and you have to keep saying it over and over again. Although you do have people, the aging thing, where the vertical invasion, as they call it, you get young people who haven't heard this, who haven't been through with a President Kimball and President Benson, who are incapacitated, and they think like Thomas S. Monson or Gordon B. Hinckley, Thomas S. Monson, or President Nelson, where they're really with it up till the end. Keys of the kingdom. That's the keys to direct the church, and from time to time, as shall be manifested by the Comforter, receive revelations to unfold the mysteries of the kingdom. What are the mysteries of the kingdom? That's just anything that's associated with governing the kingdom. It can refer to the temple endowment, as Harold B. Lee talked about it, the direction the kingdom needs to take, and to set and order the churches and study and learn and become acquainted with all good books and languages, tongues, and people. And this shall be your business and your mission in all your lives, to preside and counsel and set in order the affairs of the church and the kingdom. Well, that's the mission statement. That's the revelation guiding the first presidency. That's if you get called. Someone I'm talking to right now may get called into the first presidency, and if you hear this and you get called there, that you're supposed to do. Acquainted with good books, languages, tongues, and people. President Henry B. Eyring talks about as his father was born in Mexico, in the Mexican colonies. So his father grew up speaking Spanish, but his father just drilled Henry B. Eyring on physics, and when he should have been teaching him Spanish, because you remember the first presidency, which is more important. 47th problem of Euclid, Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, or being able to speak Spanish like a native. Yeah, speaking Spanish. Various points of this section, the School of Prophets. We've covered that earlier. So we do church education differently. They didn't have a lot of buildings, so they'd double up. The temple would be a schoolhouse. We now have BYU celebrating 150 years, so rise and shout with that. I am a graduate of BYU, so I had to throw that in there. Missionary work in all languages. That's part of the reason why you have a BYU, to specialize in languages and how to teach language. It's because early on what they do is they just send you out there, and then they had what's called the mission home in Salt Lake City, where you get about 3 days of instruction. Finally, I don't know if you knew this, but a foreign mission, someone would, for a stateside mission, you'd be for 2 years, and foreign missions would be for 3 years. Early on, they made that uniform. The early 1980s, they went back to 18 months for both men and women, and they changed that. They had what's called the LTM, the Language Training Mission. It was in the Knight Magnum building, which has been demolished at BYU as a predecessor to the MTC. And so they had the Language Training Mission and having an MTC, and then now it's a little bit different. We do the at-home MTC, and it just keeps changing. But yeah, the need for languages. I served my mission in Portugal. I'm glad for the language help. Put your families in order. We're going to talk about the next section in Section 93. Members of the First Presidency get taken to the tool shed because they're neglecting your families. You understanding the bishop's duties. This section also mentions Vienna Jacques. There was a good article about her from in the Ensign from 06/2016. So you just put her name in. We talk a lot about Emma, go back and forth about her, what happened after Joseph Smith died, issues with polygamy, yes, no, heck no, no, yes, no, heck no. And you have the ceased wearying me. That the unjust judge. You're supposed to weary God, and God sometimes says, "Okay, knock it off. I've heard you. It's time to move on here." Now it's interesting. Section 92 is a small one. Frederick G. Williams. It talks about the United Order. We understand this is the United Firm, where he is called into that, and the resources the church has talking about the United Firm, and the United Order. It's interesting. The key takeaway from this that I get is he was told to be a lively member. Now, not an active member, but lively member. The opposite being dead. Are you dead or are you lively? Not active or inactive, but are you lively? Are you dead? Are you alive in Christ? Or are you dead to Christ? But also we should make a distinction that it was been in the church. President Packer mentioned it in April 2012 about being active in the church versus being active in the gospel. For example, my longest time, my grandmother had Alzheimer's disease. My grandfather wouldn't go to church because he'd have to go help take care of her at the rest home, and he'd have to feed her. And yeah, I watched my grandpa feed my grandma. My grandma would not recognize us. And that's a passage in Isaiah. Can a mother forget her children? Well, yeah, my grandmother would not recognize me, but my grandpa would feed her like a baby. And that's active in the gospel, but not active in the church. So make that distinction. When people don't show up to church, sometimes they're doing it for good reasons. Section 91. About the Apocrypha. Now, what happens is that Bible-believing church, do you believe the Bible? Well, which Bible? There's different books in the Bible. For example, the Bible we use, King James, is actually a Protestant version. As you read the epistle dedicatory in it, it uses this expression, popish. Okay, this is anti-Catholic translation we're using. But the Bible that Joseph Smith had when he was doing the Joseph Smith translation had a copy of the Apocrypha in it. And so Joseph Smith, okay, what do I do with this? And so God got a revelation about it. What happened is the Bible that Martin Luther grew up with, which is the St. Jerome Vulgate translation, it was translated into Latin. And then, that. And so there's language shifting. You go from Latin to English, from Greek and Hebrew to Latin to English. It creates some translation problems. A lot of shift in the language. Then you have the Septuagint, and then that's a whole other lesson about the Septuagint translation. But it had extra books in there, and when Martin Luther was doing the Protestant Reformation, on his own, he just took the books out of the Bible, which I always think is interesting because our Protestant friends will emphasize, the authority of the Word, the authority of the Bible. Some of these churches are called a Bible church, which means they're non-denominational, to try and focus on the Bible teaching without the baggage of ideology or denomination. But, where did Martin Luther get the authority to just, on his own, pull books out of the Bible, saying, okay, this is dumb, let's pull it out? He had issues with James, the Epistle of Straw. Revelation was always a debated book. But, this is how you clear up that question with Revelation. It is interesting. On my mission, I had trouble getting my visa, and I went to Florida. And we were talking with this lady, and she said, yeah, my Bible has all these extra books in it. And I can't remember if we looked at it. I just remember saying, okay, yeah, this is probably the Apocrypha, so she had a Catholic Bible. So it's interesting, as there's broader texts that are missing from the Bible. Now, we understand that from the Book of Mormon, Zenos and Zenock. In the Bible, Iddo the seer, you get mentions of the lost books of the Bible, missing epistles. We have in 2 Corinthians, it mentions, this is the third time I've written to you. Okay, well, where's the first one? It's, in the argument is people start defending the Bible and start defending indefensible things. There's stuff missing. There's called pseudepigraphia. There's a lot of stuff out there, stuff like that that's covered. If you remember the heyday of the Da Vinci Code, yeah, there's stuff missing from the Bible. The Book of Judas, that type of stuff. Is it legitimate? Is it spurious? So what the Council of Joseph Smith gets, when we get the Apocrypha, just kind of look at it. Some of it's good. Pray for discernment. It's a fun read. Now, here's a fun thing. One of the books is called Tobit, not Hobbit, Hobbit, no, but Tobit, Tobit. In chapter 6, verse 17, that verse suggests there's foreordination in marriage. Okay, so Tobit 6:17. That's some fun to look at. So we're at 20 minutes, and I went a little bit longer. I sometimes improvise stories as stuff comes to my mind. point 3 of the Word of Wisdom. Here we are. Now, just begin with this comment. I love you, and as a Christ-like person, I will not be an enabler. So you're not going to get me giving you permission to do something you know is wrong in this podcast, in this lesson. So the big question we have is this a commandment? Why are you asking that? It should be the question. Is like, well, I just want to make sure I'm understanding this properly, or you're trying to weasel out and feed an addiction. If you're trying to weasel out to doing something you know is right and feed an addiction, sorry, I won't help you. I will not enable you. Now, it's interesting. In the Book of Commandments, there's a distinction between what is a revelation and what is a commandment. Now, we smush those things together, but there is a distinction early on. And as you read the Book of Commandments, you'll read it says, this is a commandment, this is a revelation, this is a commandment. You can go online to the Joseph Smith papers. They've scanned in Wilford Woodruff's copy of the Book of Commandments, so you can read what he read. But this is what the Joseph Smith paper says. In the 1830s, Smith and his followers used the terms commandment and revelation to refer to those dictations that they viewed as divine commandments. Usage pattern in early documents suggests in the earliest years, Latter-day Saints may have seen a subtle difference in the meaning of these terms. Commandments may have denoted communications that required action or obedience, whereas revelation may have been referred to communications on doctrinal topics. So that's Joseph Smith papers. I put the link in here, articles, editorial method. And so a revelation would be something like Section 88. Or a vision of the degrees of glory, where you're just giving a bunch of information, but a commandment would be to a person, giving them, okay, here's your specific direction. For example, our patriarchal blessings would be considered commandments. Section 19, it says this is not a commandment of man or of men, but of God, and you see that as given specifically for action for Martin Harris here at the end. Okay, get yourself out of debt, watch the adultery, don't covet your property. So that's information to the wise, is that what he's saying is, from that sense, the word of wisdom would be a revelation. He's describing, there's these conspiring men, secret combinations among the food producers to try to get us addicted to stuff. Does that feel right? Does that sound good? Okay. And it's just giving information about it. Now, it says it's not by constraint, and no revelation is by constraint. We don't force people to do stuff. This occasionally happens in Utah where a son says he doesn't want to serve a mission, so the father physically assaults him. This happens here and there in Utah. Now, we respect your agency, and it's the same thing with the word of wisdom. Just admit to yourself, yeah, I am breaking the word of wisdom, versus saying, oh no, this is compliant with the word of wisdom, so I'm doing it, versus saying, yeah, I am breaking the word of wisdom, but I'm exercising my agency. So at the time, it wasn't seen as obligatory, which is funny because consistently, they always saw it as obligatory, but individual members. So the church saw it as obligatory, but the individual members wouldn't keep it. So when you read the documents, we just had a hard time with it. You read Parley P. Pratt's autobiography. He's drinking coffee when he's on the run, kicking back with some Maxwell House. You see it with the pioneers. I think some of them brought coffee along. It was just a love-hate relationship early on. So 1851, Brigham Young put his foot down. Brigham Young chewed tobacco. Now, this is something about chewing tobacco, is if you have a lot of cavities, apparently chewing tobacco helps ease the pain of cavities, because you know what dental work was like back then, just pliers. Jack London had the same problem. This is where I first learned, was reading about Jack London. He didn't have a toothbrush until he was like 18, so he had really bad teeth problems and a lot of cavities, and so he'd chew tobacco to ease the pain. And Brigham Young apparently did the same thing. But 1851, he brought it up again. Just went back and forth. So finally, Heber J. Grant in the 1920s, 1930s would put it down. Sometimes what he'd do in general conference is just read the entire Section 89, saying, okay, look, this is it. Lorenzo Snow put his foot down with tithing. Heber J. Grant said, we're putting our foot down with Word of Wisdom. Ezra Taft Benson putting our foot down with the Book of Mormon. Russell Nelson, we're putting our foot down with the using the correct name of the church. It takes a while for us to grow into things. We're still struggling with addictions, and with different cultures, they have all these substances. Like, does mate, yerba mate, fit under the Word of Wisdom? Okay, We'll just study it out. So I guess the principle is continuing revelation. Does continuing revelation, ongoing restoration, apply to the word of wisdom? So it says in the canon, not, but has there been a subsequent revelation? And I'll say, yeah, there has been. And just be honest with yourself. Just don't try and say, oh, this isn't a commandment. It's not against the word of wisdom. Say, yes, I have an addiction. I like this physical stimulus I get from these substances. Just be healthy. Your future self will thank you for this. Focus on the promises. Begin with the end of mind. Start with the end of the revelation. What are the promises? There's phraseology associated with the temple. That ought to tickle your ears as you're debating whether or not to sip that chilled latte. Health of the navel, marrow in the bones. Of course, the physical health, but you have the hidden treasures of knowledge. The word of wisdom affects your spirituality. You're drunk, you're high, and you're addicted. You think you really can serve as a bishop, as a missionary. What spirit's influencing you? Steady diet of cheeseburger will affect your brain chemistry. And if your brain's out of whack, your capacity to get revelation is going to be out of whack. Your capacity to gather Israel is going to be out of whack. Constantly needing a caffeine jolt to get through the day, whether hot or cold caffeine, whatever you take on it. Caffeine against the word of wisdom. Well, let's get into the negatives. So it talks about wine and strong drink. That's all type of liquor. I know there's a difference between liquor and stuff. I'm just not into it. You kind of know what it is. If you don't need a detailed explanation. Tobacco, however, there's a good use for tobacco, and that's with cattle. Hot drinks. The words tea and coffee are not in the order of wisdom. You get this expression, hot drinks, and the handbook. The church has just says, look, there's only one interpretation of the word of wisdom. This tea and hot drinks means tea and coffee. Now, I did research. Now, every president of the church who was alive with Joseph Smith always understood this. Brigham Young, John Taylor, Joseph F. Smith. Hiram Smith gave a talk on the word of wisdom at Nauvoo, and he said that hot drinks refers to tea and coffee, and so that's. You just have a very clear and compelling case. So that's what that idiom means. So it's not about, drinking hot chocolate or, a hot A&W root beer. It's not the temperature. It's just this kind of unusual idiom that we had for it. So it's tea and coffee, and then, you're drinking a iced latte from Starbucks, so it's not a hot drink, so it's okay. Okay. Now, where does caffeine come in? That's interesting. I think it was John A. Widsoe, who is a chemist trained at Harvard. He's one, I think, who started talking about it first. And he wrote a book on the word of wisdom. And it's like what President Nelson talked about at the quote at the beginning. We sometimes use scientific data, and it's helpful, but that's not the reason why we do it. But he provided some scientific data, and he mentioned caffeine as an addictive substance. It sort of took on a life of its own. Joseph F. Smith, in Answers to Gospel Questions, talked about caffeine, but really it's not in there. So it's not against the letter of the law, but it's caffeine against the spirit of the law. Like I said, what's all this caffeine doing to the capillaries in your eyes after 6 decades? So in the positive, wholesome herbs and fruit, flesh of beasts and fowls to be used sparingly. There's interesting. There's an added comment there. It's not pleasing that it should be only used in time of winter. That if you read earlier editions, there's an extra comment in there, and some people. Okay, we're not strict vegetarians, as we read in section 49. If you forbid to eat meat, that's not a god. But a lot of this is just common sense stuff. Grains. Eat stuff in the proper season. Make sure you're understanding food properly. You're not feeding addictions. Watch some movies from the. I was watching an Alfred Hitchcock movie, North by Northwest. And it was interesting to see how slender and slim the people were back then in 1958 compared to now. Admittedly, it's Hollywood. They're actors. They're There's girdles and amphetamines that they use to keep the weight off. But it's noticeable. Watch these old movies about the weight people have, because they're not sitting playing on their cell phones all day. Okay, we're at a half an hour. That's the word of wisdom. It's just common sense, good living. You have a good idea about what you should and shouldn't do. I mean, if you have some technical questions, I'm not going to give you permission to indulge in any vice. Sometimes we'd ask, okay, is such and such against the word of wisdom? Is caffeine? Is yerba mate? Doesn't specifically mention chocodiles or Hostess fruit pies in there, so I'm completely at a loss at it. President Hinckley said, it doesn't talk about arsenic in the word of wisdom or jumping into an empty swimming pool. Another way to reframe the question is, does this substance lead me to Christ? Does these energy drinks, are they leading me to Christ, or am I just feeding an addiction and a stimulation, giving into my baser passion instead of following Christ? I want to, as Elder Maxwell said, I want to break a covenant in order to fix an appetite. Again, that's the word of wisdom. You have a good idea about it. Bruce R. McConaughey said, the gospel isn't the word of wisdom, and the word of wisdom isn't the gospel, so don't become a crank or a crackpot with it. That's from Mormon doctrine. So here we are at the end, half an hour Christ quotient. So begin with the atonement quotient. Can you connect the word of wisdom to the atonement? How are you treating your body? Are you being a good steward of your body? I heard this story about this lady who visited New Zealand. In America, people would criticize New Zealanders for getting some of the tribal tattoos. That in New Zealand, they criticize Americans for getting plastic surgery. What are you doing with your bodies? How are you treating it? Are you doing something that's going to inhibit your ability to get revelation? Is there a connection between the word of wisdom, personal revelation, your spirituality? The resurrection, you're going to resurrect with a certain way. It's dependent upon your, the degree of resurrection depends upon your spirituality and the level of faith. What's the word of wisdom do? Remember, it's said to the least of the saints. The least that can be called saints. It's a bare minimum. Oh, here's something else I just remembered is the first three sections. I should have done this a little bit. I'm doing stuff off the top of my head right now. The first three verses were actually the heading, and they just got subsumed into the text of the Revelation. So if you go back and read the one from the 1835 edition of the Doctrine and Covenants, it reads a little bit different. So it's been an evolving section, evolving attitudes. I should say perfecting attitudes toward the word of wisdom that affects your spirituality. God gave it to us for a reason. Second quotient, of course, let's go. There are other sections here about the word of not just the word of wisdom, but about the first presidency. Are you following the first presidency, the direction to use the correct name of the church? Or have you reviewed the 14 fundamentals and following the prophets? Here's another thing. Word of wisdom, the second coming. How does the word of wisdom prepare you for the second coming? Healthy saints can survive the calamities. Healthy saints will have clean bodies. They'll get good revelation and be able to prepare for the second coming. No one knows the day nor hour, but there's sort of other things you can do to prepare. You can be a wise virgin in this matter and have the oil you have, and part of that oil is the word of wisdom, keeping that. And just remember, he's coming. Christ is coming, and that's the point.